Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of this week's session, looking at between participants analysis of variance. So just a quick recap on where we left off. We had conducted a two-way analysis of variance, looking at the effect of in-group status and audience and their interaction on perceptions of conflict. We saw that we got three effects. We got the main effects and the interaction. Those two main effects of status and audience were both non-significant, but the interaction between them was significant, which indicates that the effect of in-group status was significantly different at different levels of audience. Okay, so that's quite good news for the hypothesis in one sense. It's consistent with that hypothesis that there would be an interaction between status and audience, the two independent variables. But what about the more specific prediction that the high versus low in-group status difference would affect perceived conflict only in the outgroup audience condition? That's a bit more precise than the information that's given to us just by the interaction. Okay. What it needs in turn is analysis of the effect of status, that first independent variable, at each different level of the audience independent variable. Okay. So our analysis options there are what's known as simple main effects. Simple main effects analysis is usually done in the context of significant interaction effects and involves sort of drilling down into that to look at where the effect of one independent variable is significant or not at different levels of the other independent variable or independent variables. Okay, so in the context of our design, it involves testing the effect of status at each different level of audience, at each of those two different levels of audience. Okay, so just in schematic terms again, whereas the overall main effect of status involves looking at this difference collapsed across in-group and out-group audience conditions, the simple main effects analysis involves looking at the effect of status specifically in the in-group audience condition and then specifically in the out-group audience condition. Okay, so let's go back to that analysis that we've conducted and add a simple main effects analysis. Okay, so this is the ANOVA that we ran, okay, the significant interaction. Now to do simple main effects analysis, we just need to go to, this is our analysis, our model. We just need to go to the simple effects drop-down menu. Okay. Now here, when thinking about interactions and simple main effects in particular, it's often very useful if we are in conceptual terms thinking about one of our independent variables as being like the main or the focal independent variable, the thing that we're most interested in the effect of. Then the second or third or whatever independent variables are the moderators. Okay, so moderator variables are things or variables that change the effect of your focal or main independent variable on the outcome. All right. So in the present case, our focal or our main independent variable might well be thought of as in-group status. Now that's not a statistical thing, that's a theory-based thing. It's a thing that's based on our research question. Okay, our main independent variable might be in-group status, and audience therefore is our moderator variable. Okay, that specific term for an independent variable that changes the effect of another independent variable. So for specifying simple effects, what we want to do in the simple effect variable box is include the variable, the independent variable that's our main, our focal independent variable, the thing that we want to know effects of. What do we want simple effects of? Of in-group status in this case. And what do we want those simple effects broken down by? We want them broken down by different levels of audience as our moderator variable. Okay, so when I add that, we get another part of the output appearing. Okay, simple effects. And what this gives us is effectively an ANOVA table of the effect of in-group status broken down separately by each condition of audience, the in-group condition and the out-group condition. Okay, and here we can see that that effect was not significant in the in-group audience condition, but it was significant in the outgroup audience condition. Okay. So just back to Jamovi to zoom in on that. Here we've got the means, okay, broken down by in-group status and audience. So here are the two high status conditions for in-group and out-group audience, the low status conditions for the in-group and out-group audience, and the means in each of those. And here are the results of those simple main effects analyses. Okay, so again, as I said just a sec ago, the simple main effect of status is not significant in the in-group audience condition, but it is significant in the out-group audience condition. Okay, and that's a little bit more consistent in precise terms with the prediction, the hypothesis that we had. It's also possible very easily in Jamovi to, in that analysis sort of option set that you have with general linear models, to ask for a plot. And a plot of an interaction effect, a figure or a graph of an interaction effect, can be a really effective way of communicating it to a reader. Okay, just visually, the nature of the interaction pops out for them a lot easier. All right. So this is a figure, a plot of that interaction effect. Excuse me. And here we can see that we have an effective status, low versus high, but separate lines for each of the audience conditions, in-group and out-group audience. Okay. And we can see from this that the low status condition, this is the mean value, each of the dots is the mean value in each condition. The mean of perceived conflict in the low status condition is greater, so if we go across, it's outside the 95% confidence interval for the high status condition. So this is significantly higher than this, but that's not the case for the in-group audience condition. Okay, so a plot of the interaction effect is a very useful way of visualizing and communicating it to a reader or anybody else. So sticking with two-way designs, but again adding another little layer of complexity on top of it. Let's go back to that hypothesis that we had, that group members will be less likely to perceive conflict with another group when their own group has high or equal status relative to an outgroup. So that implied 3 rather than 2 levels of in-group status. But again, we're suggesting here that that's only going to be the case when addressing an outgroup audience rather than an in-group audience. In other words, it's going to be moderated, that effective status is going to be moderated by by the audience to which we think our responses are being addressed. There'll be an interaction effect. So again, we've got 2 independent variables, status and audience, but this time, rather than 2 levels, status has 3 levels. Schematically, again, what we're suggesting is that we've got, these are the comparisons between status. In the in-group audience condition, there's not going to be much difference, but in the out-group audience condition, we're expecting the low condition, okay, to see higher scores in perceived conflict relative to the high and the equal status conditions. So let's see that in action. Back to Jamovi. So this is the design that had low, high, and equal status. This time we're going to run a general linear model, an ANOVA, with conflict again as the outcome variable, status as the first factor, and audience now as a second factor. Okay. There's the ANOVA table. I'm also going to ask for the marginal means. And now also, because we were predicting an interaction effect, I'm going to ask for the simple effects of status as our focal independent variable broken down by each level of audience. Okay, so we've got our ANOVA table here. We can already see that the interaction actually wasn't quite significant. And our simple effects here tell us that the effect of status was significant in the outgroup audience condition, but not in the in-group audience condition. However, those are not significantly different from one another. That's what the interaction tests. So although the effective status is significant here but not here, we shouldn't necessarily interpret those effects as being different from one another. Okay. Now, because status has 3 levels rather than 2, we can delve down even further, okay, with a little bit more precision. Because we also get contrasts of, in the simple effects sort of output section, we also get simple contrasts, pairwise comparisons for the low versus the equal and the low versus the high conditions, again broken down by in-group and out-group audience conditions. So we can see that even though in the out-group audience condition, okay, the overall effective status is significant, we can see that the low versus the equal condition contrast is significant, and the low versus the high contrast is significant. Now we can change the coding of in-group status again to Helmert coding, so we get a contrast of low versus equal and high combined. Okay, that's what we get there. That is also significant. Okay, so again, just to reiterate, key bits of the output to emphasize here. We've got our 3 effects from our two-way design, the 2 main effects and the interaction. The effective status, the main effective status, is significant. But the interaction between status and audience, that test of whether the effective status is different at different levels of audience, was not quite significant. Okay. In terms of the simple effects, okay, we have, again, the simple main effect of status, only significant in the outgroup audience condition, and those pairwise comparisons reveal that the high and the equal conditions, each in turn, differ significantly from the low status condition, but again, only in the outgroup audience condition. We can see that those same contrasts in the in-group audience condition were not significant. And again, here's a plot of the interaction effect showing those low versus equal versus high means for the status variable broken down separately by in-group and out-group audience condition. Okay, we've got a higher value here compared to the equal and the high conditions, but only for the out-group audience condition. All right, not for the in-group audience condition. So let's finish off by considering an even more complex design. What about designs with more than 2 independent variables? Okay, well, let's take our core hypothesis that group members will be less likely to perceive conflict with another group when their in-group has high status. And now we've got our first moderating variable, that's only going to happen when addressing an out-group audience rather than an in-group audience. But we might in turn theorize that we're only going to see these effects when perceived threat is low, okay, rather than high. So we're only going to see an effective status, that sort of strategic effect of status, when perceived threat is low. Because what will happen if we generally perceive a threat from the outgroup is that we're going to perceive conflict across the board, okay? It doesn't matter what the group status is. If we feel threatened by another group, we're going to perceive conflict with that group, okay? So the effect is going to be wiped out when perceived threat is high, and we're only going to see it when perceived threat is low, which gives a little bit of breathing space, if you like, for the effect of status. So now we've got 3 independent variables implied by this specification, okay? We've got status, as we've seen, we've got audience, as we've also seen, but now we've got a 3rd independent variable, threat, the threat posed by the other group. Is it high or is it low? And our hypothesis here is suggesting that we're going to see an effect of the first independent variable, status, but that's going to depend on the second independent variable, audience, but now in turn we're only going to see that at specific levels of a 3rd independent variable, threat. So what that is suggesting to us is we're going to expect in the analysis a significant 3-way interaction between those 3 independent variables. Okay. Again, in schematic terms, it's quite useful to break this down. Okay. So this is a box that we've seen before, okay? So we've got an effect of status, high versus low, that we're not going to see in the in-group audience condition. We do expect to see it in the out-group audience condition. But now we're seeing that in turn, we only expect to see that in the low threat condition, okay? In contrast, when threat is high, we're going to see perceptions of conflict in turn elevated across the board. So our analysis options here, we've got 3 independent variables, so it's going to be a 3-way analysis of variance. Now in a 3-way ANOVA, you're going to end up with 7 different effects. Okay, what it's going to give you are the 3 main effects of each of the 3 independent variables. In turn, it's going to give you the 3 possible 2-way interactions between each pair of independent variables. So the 2-way interaction between status and audience, between status and threat, and between threat and audience. And finally, the 7th effect is going to be the 3-way interaction between the 3 independent variables. And that is the test of whether the effect of status depends on audience, but in turn only at specific levels of threat. So let's see that in Jamovi. Okay, here we have a data set that has our outcome variable and now 3 independent variables. So we go to general linear model once again. Our outcome variable again is perceptions of conflict. We've got status as a first factor, audience as a second factor, and now threat as a 3rd independent variable. We're going to ask for the breakdown of means at each of those combinations of variables. And we're also going to ask for simple main effects of status, as we did before, but now not only by audience, but also by threat. Okay, so we've got the 2 moderators in there, not just 1. Okay, so there's our ANOVA table and our simple effects output. So let's just pull out some of the key aspects of that. This is the ANOVA table with our 7 effects, the 3 main effects, the 3 possible 2-way interactions, and finally the 3-way interaction between all 3 independent variables. Now, as we can see, that is not significant. Okay, getting there, but not significant. So we shouldn't conclude that the effect of status depends on audience, but only at specific levels of threat. Okay. Looking at those simple main effects analyses, we now have 4 simple main effects of status, 1 for each combination of the 2 moderator variables, the 2 levels, the variables of threat and audience. We've got the effect of status for low threat in-group audience, low threat out-group audience, high threat in-group audience, and high threat out-group audience. Okay, and we can see that, sort of in line with the hypothesis, the simple main effect of status was actually only significant in the out-group audience condition when threat was low compared to when threat was high. In the out-group audience condition when threat was high, there was no effect. Okay. Again, very useful to plot this, so we can see when threat is high, there isn't really an effect of status, but when threat is low, okay, the effect of status does appear to be significant in the out-group audience condition, but only when threat is low. So what can we conclude from that? Well, descriptively, we've got a pattern that is sort of in line with the hypothesis, but the crucial thing is that 3-way interaction was not significant. So even though the pattern overall is tending in the direction we would have predicted, we should not conclude on the basis of that the dependence of the effect on threat is significant. Okay. Remember, an interaction tests whether an effect differs at different levels of another variable. Okay. In this case, it was not significant, so we shouldn't conclude that the status by audience effect differs as a function of threat. So that's it for between participants analysis of variance. In the final part of this week's session, I will discuss effect sizes. Okay, join me then.